Hello everyone, this is TheNelston. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm here with a quick showcase of the Minecraft Scape and Run Parasites mod for 1.12.2. I'm going to keep this introduction brief because there are a lot of things we need to cover today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask away in the comment section. Otherwise, there are timestamps available both in the description and as a chapter system on the video itself. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the video. I'll see you guys soon. The first two enemies that we're going to talk about are the Buglin and the Ruptor. These guys are the most common of the Scape and Run parasites, and they will spawn pretty much anywhere that the light level is low enough. Starting off with the Buglin, these guys are pretty weak. As you can see, I do have full diamond armor, but yeah, they don't really do that much damage. They're kind of just like little silverfish, and they're really more annoying than anything else. But left alone for long enough, these guys will eventually evolve into what is known as a Ruptor. Now, Ruptors are the guys that you're going to really have to keep an eye out for. They have 10 health and they're quite fast actually, and if they hit you, they will actually slow you down. So you do have to try and get away from them before they get a chance to hit you at all. Now, obviously, they do quite a bit of damage on their own. As you can see, I do have full diamond, like I mentioned, but they're still doing a significant amount of damage to me. But where their real danger lies is with their ability to infect other mobs. So if I summon some pigs here, you can see that they'll go immediately after the pigs, and upon killing the pigs, they'll convert them into these infected pigs. Now these guys are terrifying. You see they have soulless eyes, unhinged jaws, and just look very emaciated overall. So left alone, these Ruptors will go around your world and basically turn all of the mobs into their infected variants. So there are currently 6 different types of infected mobs, and we'll be taking a look at each of them very shortly. Starting, of course, with the pig that we saw a little bit earlier. So once the pig dies, it turns into an infected pig. There are also infected villagers, infected cows, infected sheep, infected wolves, and infected humans, which are created when zombies are killed by a Ruptor. There are 2 mobs that technically fit into this category, but don't actually get spawned by a Ruptor killing something, so I'm gonna include them as a separate list of entities, if you will. The first enemy is the infected Alafha, which is basically just a disgusting flying moth that can be found in any jungle type biome. Now they do look scary, but the bright side is that they don't actually have a melee attack, so they will try to keep their distance from you and kind of lob balls at you instead. The next mob that I want to talk about is the infected big spider. Now, despite their name, they actually don't come from any spiders getting killed. Instead, they will be spawned by bosses or adapted mobs as kind of minions. Now, if I set myself into survival mode, you'll see that they do have a melee attack. And yeah, sometimes if they have those dots, they will have poison, but most of them don't really have poison. Now, they do a decent amount of melee damage, but you saw that the web ability is really what's kind of the most dangerous, right? If you get caught in a web like I just did, you're basically toast. Now, these guys are fine and dandy by themselves, and by fine and dandy, I mean absolutely terrifying, but they get worse. If these infected mobs get enough kills on any passive mob of their choice, so for example villagers in this case, and there are at least 3 other infected mobs nearby, they will all melt down into this moving flesh and then try to merge together towards one another. And you can actually kill them in this phase, so I would highly recommend doing that while you still can. But once they merge together, they'll go ahead and slowly cocoon. Now, these mobs are known as primitive class mobs. So there are 6 different types of primitive mobs, and we're going to go through each of them one by one. The first one we're going to start off with is the primitive long arms. Now, these guys are pretty standard as far as mobs go. If I go ahead and set myself in survival mode, you'll see that they kind of just charge at me and try to kill me. Like, that's basically it. They do melee attacks, and when they're not rushing at you like a sprint, you can actually kite them pretty easily just by moving backwards. So as long as you're sprinting, they will never be able to catch up to you whatsoever. Now, the next mob I want to talk about is the primitive bolster. These guys aren't very impressive on their own. As you can see, they're quite slow, they have very little hit points compared to the other primitive mobs, and they only have a basic melee attack. But where they really shine is in their ability to buff other nearby parasites. So you just saw there that Ruptors normally have 10 health, but this bolster just went ahead and gave them an additional 4 hit points. The next mob that I want to talk about are these primitive summoners. And similar to the bolster from before, they don't really have that much going for them in terms of their own attack damage. So if I go ahead and set myself into survival mode, you'll see that they'll go ahead and summon Ruptors to kind of back them up in battle. The next mob we're going to take a look at is the primitive Reeker. Now if you go ahead and look at its hit points, it only has 10 hit points and of course a modest amount of armor, so it does look pretty easy to deal with, but be careful, these guys are deceptively dangerous. If I put myself into survival mode and I just go ahead and let him out, you'll see that, oh god, he runs very fast, does an insane amount of damage, and yeah, it's just terrifying. The next mob we're going to take a look at, and we're going to have to act fast for this one, is the primitive Yellow Eye. So if I set myself into survival, you'll see that these guys can actually fly. And they're going to chase you around, and they don't have a melee attack, but instead, these guys will shoot poisonous projectiles at you, which don't do any damage, really, on their own, but will poison you, which can be really, really annoying. And finally, the last mob that we have is the primitive Manjucator. If I let this guy out, yeah, he'll basically just do melee attacks and, try to kill me like that. He is quite a bit faster than the long arms though, so you are really going to have to sprint and jump to get away from him. And the way that the mod author said this is intended to work is that he's supposed to have periods of brief invulnerability, but apparently they accidentally broke something and now it doesn't work as intended, so we'll have to wait until the next update for that one. Once primitive mobs get enough kills on any mob of their choice, so they'll just go around and just kill everything really, they will go ahead and transform into an adapted version of themselves. Let's go ahead and dive into the adapted forms, starting with the adapted long arms. Now, similar to their primitive counterparts, these guys will essentially just charge you and try to do as much melee damage as possible. They can also break blocks, as you just saw. So if I go into F5, yeah, they are quite deadly, and they will rip you to shreds if you're not careful. And in addition to that, they also have 120 health and a lot of armor to boot. The next mob we're going to take a look at is the adapted bolster. Now, similar to the original bolster, these guys will empower any nearby parasites, but what sets this adapted version aside from the normal versions is if I go into survival mode, they'll try to use their tentacles to pull you in towards their mouths, and they'll also do more damage with their mouths now. So yeah, unlike the original bolsters, these guys are actually very deadly just by themselves, really. The next mob that we're going to take a look at is the adapted summoner. Now, similar to the primitive summoner, this guy will summon allies to back him up during battle, but what sets him apart from the primitive version is that instead of only spawning Ruptors, he will actually summon infected mobs of other kinds as well. So you'll see he can summon infected humans, infected cows, infected pigs, and all other manners of nasty creatures. The next mob that we have is the adapted Reeker. Now, if I set myself into survival mode, not only does he do an insane amount of damage per melee hit, and also is faster than pretty much any other adapted mob, the poison is very deadly, lasts quite a long time, and yeah, you will basically die in a couple of hits if you're not careful. The next mob that we have is the adapted Yellow Eye. Now, these guys can also fly, of course. Unlike their primitive counterparts, they actually have a very powerful melee attack. And finally, we have the adapted Manjucator. If I let this guy out of his cage and I go into survival mode, yeah, he is very fast. He's gonna catch up even though I'm sprint jumping. And yeah, if I get caught on a ledge like I just did, I'm basically dead. Occasionally, adapted mobs have a chance to spawn as a mutated version of themselves, and you'll see that they're mutated because they have a different coloration compared to a regular long arms, like over here, and noticeably, they'll also have 50% of the health. Now, you didn't luck out. These guys aren't just easier to kill, Instead, they will do 50% more damage. So if I set myself into survival mode here and let this guy hit me, oh my god, 7 hearts of damage in one hit. I basically have no chance. So of course, the Parasites on their own are quite dangerous, but they can be made even more dangerous through the support system that is present in the Scape and Run Parasites mod. Now the way this system works is pretty simple. Whenever you damage or kill a Parasite, it has a chance to toll a bell, and you'll hear that, and then this thing called a Beckon will be summoned. Now the Beckon starts off at stage 1 and is, pretty relatively tame. If I go into survival here, you'll see that it spreads its tentacles, I guess you could call them. This essentially means that it is in defensive mode. It will begin summoning mobs to deal with you, such as that Ruptor that just spawned. And actually, it'll summon quite a few of these guys. And you just heard, I killed another Ruptor, so another Beckon just got summoned. Now, you saw that there's this thing called the Infested Block. And over time, these infested blocks will essentially be created by these Beckons and spread radially outward. So it'll start with just one block, but then it'll spread to these 4 adjacent blocks, and then those will spread to the adjacent blocks and those adjacent blocks, and so on and so forth. If you leave the Beckons alone for too long, they will turn into Beckon Stage 2. Now the thing about this is that not only will it spawn the basic Ruptors that the Beckon Stage 1 could summon, it can now also summon other infected mobs like that infested big spider or the infected human. Beckon Stage 2s will also have a chance to summon these flying carriers, and essentially these guys will try to fly up to you, and once they get close enough they'll blow up, leave a bunch of poison, and summon a bunch of these Ruptors as well as some Buglins to try and attack you. And if you leave the Beckon Stage 2 alone for too long, they will turn into Beckon Stage 3. And this is going to be the final form of the Beckons. These guys will not only spawn the infected mobs and the Ruptors from before, but as you can see, even some of these primitive mobs that we were talking about earlier. Another thing to note is that they will also now be able to summon 3 unique mobs that only Beckon Stage 3s can summon. The first one being this heavy carrier. Now these heavy carriers will essentially try to get up close to you, blow up, and then just summon an absolutely massive horde of enemies to come after you. And the next one is this Vigilante. Now these Vigilantes do have a melee attack. Of course, they will hit very hard, but they also have, as you saw, that poison attack that launches from very far away, and of course they will try to maintain their distance if they can, because they primarily deal damage with their ranged attack. And the third and final one being the Warden. Now I was able to one-shot that guy because I do have a bunch of strength, but this is basically a mob that will charge you similar to the long arms from before, and he'll actually have that special dash ability in which he not only sprints, but actually goes even faster than a sprint, like just straight up rushes you. Now he does do a decent bit of damage, and he will also fling you up in the air, which I feel like is the most deadly ability because of how it breaks your stride, right? And of course, if your motion gets broken, then it becomes much easier for other mobs to combo you. In addition to the Beckon itself, there are 2 main types of static defense mobs that can spawn on this infested land that will make it much harder to get to the Beckon once you let it survive for too long. The first one is this thing called the Kyphosis. If I go into game mode 0, essentially what it'll do is it'll lash out with a very, very powerful melee attack. So as long as you have a bow, you can pretty much just snipe it happily from far away. The second type of static defense mob is the Sentry. Now what this will do is it'll essentially destroy your armor with these acid pellets. So you saw I had diamond armor and now I no longer have diamond armor. And yeah, it'll just spray out these like 4 bullets, I believe, that'll give you poison for a decent amount of time, and of course also break your armor. Once you manage to go ahead and kill one of these Beckons, what'll happen is that if there's no Beckon on any of this infested soil, there will be this kind of infested, I believe residue it's called, that will slowly creep out over time. And what this will do is it'll eventually turn all of this infested land, as you can see, right back into dirt. So it is pretty nice. It's very helpful of the Parasites, to kind of do this for us. But at the same time, new mobs will eventually spawn from this infested residue, so you want to try to get rid of this as soon as possible, but also let it kind of do its trick. Occasionally, these adapted long arms and adapted mobs in general will kind of like start shaking violently, and then they'll shed this infested residue as well. So I've taken the liberty of going ahead and summoning in a bunch of Beckons stage 3s, because what'll happen is occasionally, if you kill one of these guys, it'll summon a massive ancient parasite. So the first type of ancient parasite is known as an ancient dreadnought, and this guy has 200 health and a bunch of armor. And the way he works is if I go into survival, you'll see that essentially he'll try to float down towards me and shoot these acid balls at me, which are similar to the ones from the sentries. They'll melt your armor and do a bunch of poison damage. But in addition to that, every couple of seconds, I believe about 12 seconds or so, he'll make that ghastly noise and then summon down a bunch of drop pods. Each of these drop pods will blow up, summon a lingering potion of poison, and then also one Rupture to come after you and try to kill you. Now the next type of ancient parasite is known as the Ancient Overlord. This guy has more health because he's on the ground, and slightly more armor, and does a bunch of very powerful melee attacks. Now because I have resistance like a gajillion, he can't actually damage me, but if you had regular armor, you'd basically be dead in a couple of hits. The Ancient Overlord is a bit of an easy boss fight because all he really does is slowly walk towards you. So yeah, it's really not too difficult to deal with. He will also occasionally summon Ruptures. I don't know if he'll do that since the server TPS is kind of low right now, but that will also happen, so he does have backup that can also help deal some extra damage to you. The best way to deal with the Ancient Overlord is to use Fire. Now this does apply to all parasites, but the reason I haven't mentioned it up until now is because you just saw there, these guys are very smart. If they see fire, they will actively try to avoid walking into it. So to get them on fire, you have to be pretty sneaky. You kind of have to set it right down where their hitbox is the moment they try to walk over to you, and even then, they may be able to get around it. So I would instead recommend that you just put like either fire aspect on your sword or flame on your bow in order to kind of protect yourself. Now what this does also mean is that if you're smart about it, you could theoretically create like a ring of protection around you using netherrack and fire, and these parasites would have a much harder time getting to you. You'll notice that while you kill the parasites, they'll occasionally drop fragments or pieces of themselves. So for example, you might find like long arm armor fragments from killing long arms, you might find reeker blades from killing reekers, infected flesh from killing the infected mobs. You can combine these to create different living parts. And if you combine these in a certain fashion in a crafting table, you can make yourself either a living great bow, which is the ranged weapon, or a living scythe, which is the melee weapon. Both of these are very, very, very good weapons. So the living scythe does 0.8 attack speed. So the living scythe has 0.8 attack speed, so about half as fast as that of a regular sword, but does 17 attack damage stock. So with no enchantments, it does 17 attack damage. The living great bow is similar to the bow, but of course does a little bit more damage. It does still have a pretty fast draw speed though. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them down in the comment section below. Leave a like if you liked the video, leave a dislike if you hated it, subscribe for more content like this, and as always, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.